When I was a very young boy sitting in the back of my grandparents' car on long trips, it was a very boring experience. Sure, I had a few books with me to keep me entertained, probably a Garfield book or a Batman comic, but eventually I would place the books to one side. Even Garfield and Batman couldn't keep me entertained for long. And then I simply peer out of the window. It was at this point that my imaginary friend would appear to keep me company and entertained on that long, boring drive. My imaginary friend was a jester, the kind you would see performing for a medieval king. Apart from this jester had thick rimmed black glasses, and he wore the traditional fool's hat with 3 points with jingly bells at each end. And he could run real fast, outrunning the cars that drove beside us, trying to keep up with our car, and occasionally he would wave and smile. And if a car came in the opposite direction, he would simply jump over it with ease or jump from one car on top of a bus to the rooftops of the buildings we just so happened to be driving past. Then eventually he would make his way back next to the car, waving and smiling. Picturing this character in my mind entertaining me really made the journey that much shorter. And he was so vivid and clear in my mind's eye, almost real, you might say, as ridiculous as that may seem. But as we all know, imaginary friends are just that. They're imaginary. After all, it's impossible for a thought to become sentient and act independently. Right? Well, maybe not. Not if you create a tulpa. As you may have guessed, we're going to be talking about tulpas today. It's a subject I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and I'm finally getting round to doing it. And I really do find this subject really interesting and fascinating, and I hope you guys do as well. Now, in all seriousness, I don't believe that my imaginary friend was a tulpa as vivid as he may have been as a child. But in all seriousness, a tulpa isn't really considered to be an imaginary friend, not as such. There's so much more. According to the website tulpa.info, a tulpa is described as the following. A tulpa is an entity created in the mind, acting independently of and parallel of your own consciousness. They are able to think and have their own free will, emotions and memories. In short, a tulpa is like a sentient person living in your head, separate from you. It's currently unproven whether or not tulpas are truly sentient, but in the community we treat them as such. It takes time for a tulpa to develop a convincing and complex personality. As they grow older, your attention and their life experiences will shape them into a person with their own hopes, dreams and beliefs. Like I said before, that little piece of information came from tulpa.info website, and a lot of my information today will be from this website and the popular Reddit community, which I reached out to in preparation for this episode, and everyone there treated my curiosity with kindness, and each person I spoke to were very welcoming and helpful, so I want to say thank you very much to them. I get the feeling the community may be a cautious one due to ridicule, and most members wish to remain unnamed, but I thank each and every one of you who answered my questions. And so, on today's episode, I want to tell you a little bit about tulpas, the creation process and the origin story. But first, I want to go through how you would create your own tulpa, the abridged version, I guess, as it can take quite some time, months in fact, when it comes to creating your own tulpa. Although I have heard from various sources that it is possible to create a tulpa in a single day, but not everyone shares this theory, although it is believed that some people have actually created tulpas by pure accident over time. They didn't even realise they'd done it until it became abundantly clear to them. Now, if you were to go over to Google and type in how to create a tulpa, the first website you'll probably come to is the WikiHow site, and according to many in the community, this guide is not the one to look at, so I kept away. I have also heard a lot of stories about a certain article on Vice.com which gave some wrong information and dramatised the whole thing, so if you want to look deeper into the subject, maybe avoid those two sources. Like I said before, most of my information is coming from the Tulpa Info website, which seems to be the most accepted and accurate website out there, or at least one of them, although some do follow other methods. For example, there's a page on the site that has literally over 40 guides and advice on creating a tulpa. That's not including some of the older guides. So I think it is safe to say that some people do have their own methods when creating a tulpa, but this method that I'm going to tell you today seems to be the one that most people come to when they first show an interest in the subject. Okay, so from what I've gathered, and like I said, this is the abridged version, if you are interested in creating a tulpa, you first need to decide on a form for your tulpa, and you can also pick a gender and a name, but once a tulpa has its own voice, it may wish to change some of these aspects. The form can literally be anything you like, as I'll get into a little later when I talk about the My Little Pony tulpas that have been created in the past. But also, your tulpa does not need a form at all, it's entirely up to you, especially if you have the condition of aphantasia, which makes it impossible for some people to visualize images in their own heads. Oh, and one thing I did forget to mention is, the person who creates a tulpa is normally referred to as a tulpamancer, and the whole process, the creation of tulpas, is referred to as tulpamancy. Not a lot of people in the community like this phrase, tulpamancer and tulpamancy, but a lot of them do accept it. I suppose in the end it's all up to your personal preference of what you call it. It doesn't really matter what you call yourself or the process. I get the impression this word was just used and it stuck. I for one like it. I think it sounds rather cool, tulpamancy and tulpamancer. I quite like it. Okay, so for the sake of this abridged guide, let's say that you think of another person, or should I say the form of a person just like you or me, as your tulpa, and you begin to simply focus on your creation as an actual person. Now, I've read that some guides may say you should imagine your tulpa standing just out of sight or behind you, and you should talk to your tulpa, I don't know, as you're walking to work or when you've got some time on your own. Your tulpa won't talk back, not at first, but it is important to converse regularly, and eventually your tulpa will start to talk back. It won't be talking a great deal at first, but it will start to converse with you. All the while, you need to be imagining that person and its form consistently. Holding a conversation with this new entity you have just created isn't the end of the process, and it does not mean the tulpa is fully formed. You need to keep it up, keep talking, keep communicating, keep building the image of the tulpa in your mind. And eventually, your tulpa should start to take on its own personality and even act totally independent of you and your thoughts. Normally at first, this is accompanied by a small headache or pressure in your head. This is a sign that your tulpa is thinking on its own, it's thinking independently. Now, apparently there is a place where you and your tulpa can spend time together. That's not in the real world, and the community call this place Wonderland, which is basically a place you can imagine yourself and your tulpa being in, and your wonderland can be whatever you like. You just have to use your imagination, and you can create anything you like. I've also heard that the word wonderland isn't liked by everybody in the community, just like tulpamancy and tulpamancers. But like I said before, I suppose it's all down to your personal preference, and you can call it whatever you like. You don't have to call it wonderland. I believe some people call it a mindscape. You can call it whatever you like. But like tulpamancy and tulpamancers, I kind of like wonderland. Now, wonderland can also be a retreat for your tulpa from time to time if they wish to have some time alone. And over time, it is entirely possible to create a lifelong friend that understands you perfectly, that you can talk to in your own head. Your tulpa can offer advice, tell you off when you're being silly, and comfort you when you are down. Now, apparently it is not advisable to create a tulpa on a whim, but many do create tulpas for companionship. Now, as you process with your tulpa, you can also practice something called imposition, which is basically being able to view your tulpa as though he fits perfectly into reality. Along with this, you should also be able to feel them in some manner and hear them and smell them, whilst at the same time it is important to know that they are not and never will be physical. Now, the next part I wasn't aware of until I really dived into the research on this topic, but apparently a tulpa can take control of the host, the person who created the tulpa, and I have had multiple conversations with people who have created tulpas, only to find out an hour into the conversation that I had actually been talking with the tulpa and not the host, the person who created them. And whilst talking to some of the tulpas over Reddit, many said that they were free to come and go as they please, to take over the host. Many need permission to do so, and some have even took over from the host whilst they decided to take a back seat, as life had become a little too hard. This can mean taking over partially or even controlling the full body. I actually had a conversation with a very nice person who was very helpful, and I not only discovered I was talking to the host's tulpa, but the host had 14 other tulpas, so 15 in total. And that blew my mind because before I started researching this, I thought a tulpamancer created one tulpa and one tulpa only, and that was it. Now, when I heard that people can hold many different tulpas in their mind, of course my first thought was, could this be a form of mental illness or personality disorder? And believe me, I mean no offence by that at all. I think it's only a natural thing to wonder that, and I'm sure many of you out there who are listening to this now have wondered the same thing. But I must stress, I don't believe that mental illness is the reason people create a tulpa. If anything, you could say it's a form of multiple identities because, in a way, that is exactly what it is. But when it comes down to mental illness, I don't believe that is why people create tulpas or believe that they are talking to a totally independent thought form. So, in conclusion, no, I don't think mental illness has anything to do with creating a tulpa. But unfortunately, it is one of the many insults that can be thrown upon the tulpa community with very little evidence. Tulpas can also become friends with other tulpas, but only if they are both communicating through the host. Now, over the years, there have been many people who believe that tulpas are paranormal and can become malicious and dangerous. Some have even gone so far as to say a tulpa could be a demon. This is strongly considered to be false among the community of tulpamancers. But why do tulpas have this bad press? Well, one of the main reasons can be traced way back to certain creepypastas that were created years ago before creating a tulpa was mainstream. If you don't know what a creepypasta is, it's a short horror story submitted by visitors to the 4chan website for others to read, and over the years it's found itself into popular culture. It was in one of these stories that tulpas were introduced and portrayed in a negative manner. This isn't the only place that a tulpa has been portrayed as an evil entity. I first heard of a tulpa way back in 1999 in Wes Craven's New Nightmare movie, which was another Freddy Krueger movie, but this movie featured the actual actors from the previous Nightmares on Elm Street portraying themselves, well, a certain version of themselves, the actors in the real world. And whilst the writer Wes Craven is writing a New Nightmare on Elm Street story, the actress Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy in the first movie, and her son keep having hallucinations of Freddy Krueger in the real world, as he slowly becomes more and more real throughout the movie. That was manifesting through thought power of the fans and ultimately taking on the form of Freddy for the movie's end. And it's actually a very good movie. It was a brilliant idea, but once again, it shined a negative light on tulpas. Actually, a quick Google search shows me that tulpas turn up quite a lot in movies, and nearly all of the movies are horror movies. But that doesn't mean your tulpa can't get upset with you or angry at you. It has been said that a tulpa can scorn you and disapprove of your actions. For example, if you're not taking care of your body, or you're not getting enough sleep, or you're not eating correctly, your tulpa may state its opinion on the matter. Next, I want to explore where the idea of a tulpa originated. Well, even though I'm sure it dates back even further than what I'm about to tell you, it is believed that a lady named Alexandra David Neal brought the subject of tulpas into the mainstream when she actually created one of her own, and even claimed to have seen other people's tulpas from time to time, and she wrote about it in her diary entries, which later were published as books. Alexandra David Neal was born on the 24th of October 1868 and lived until the 8th of September 1969. She was a Belgian-French explorer, spiritualist, Buddhist and anarchist, opera singer and writer, and believe me, this lady had quite an extraordinary life. She was a born explorer. Even at the young age of 15, she attempted to run away from home to explore England, which she actually failed to due to money running out. But at the age of 18, she'd visited many different countries and had quite a few amazing experiences under her belt. This included studying in the Theosophical Society and Freemasonry, as well as many other interests. By 1889, she'd become devoted to Buddhism, and in 1911 she arrived in Tibet to further her studies and met with the Dalai Lama, who encouraged her with her learning and welcomed her with open arms. It was during this time period of her life that she apparently encountered tulpas and even created her own. And like I said, it was all recorded in her diary entries, and it was later published into a book. And I'd like to read you some of these entries from her book, which I found on selfdefinition.org website, which took certain parts of the book where she was talking about tulpas and other thought forms. The first entry I want to read for you was actually written for Alexandra from the Dalai Lama, explaining what a bodhisattva is. You'll have to excuse me if I pronounce some of these Tibetan words incorrectly. I am trying my best. Okay, according to selfdefinition.org, a bodhisattva is a being who has attained a high degree of spiritual perfection immediately before that of a Buddha. Whilst doing a little bit more research into what a bodhisattva is, I discovered it is someone who is practicing Buddhism and they've almost reached enlightenment and nirvana, and they decide to postpone it for a little bit so they can help others in their journey. Okay, so the diary entry reads, a bodhisattva is a basis of countless magic forms by the power generated in a state of perfect concentration of mind. It may at one or at the same time show a phantom, a sprolpa, which is actually an early word for tulpa. They actually pronounced it sprulpa. Somewhere in the middle there it changed to tulpa. He may show a sprulpa of himself in thousand millions of worlds. He may create not only human forms but any form he chooses, even those of inanimated objects such as hills, enclosures, houses, forests, roads, bridges, etc. He may produce atmospheric phenomena, as well as a thirst-quenching beverage of immortality. In fact, there is no limit to his power of phantom creation. And then later on in the book, Alexandra went on to describe some of the experiences she had with tulpas whilst learning Buddhism. And here is the first story that she told in her book. A young Tibetan who was in my service went to see his family. I granted him 3 weeks' leave, after which he was to purchase a food supply, engage porters to carry the loads across the hills, and come back with the caravan. Most likely the fellow had a good time with his people. 2 months elapsed and still he did not return. I thought he had definitely left me. Then I saw him one night in a dream. He arrived at my place clad in somewhat unusual fashion, wearing a sun hat of foreign shape. He had never worn such a hat. The next morning one of my servants came to me in haste. Wangdu had come back, he told me. I have just seen him down the hill. The coincidence was strange. I went out of my room to look at the traveller. The place where I stood dominated a valley. I distinctly saw Wangdu. He was dressed exactly as I had seen him in my dream. He was alone and was walking slowly up the path that wound up the hill slope. I remarked that he had no luggage with him, and the servant who was next to me answered, Wangdu has walked ahead. The load carriers must be following. We both continued to observe the man. He reached a small chorten, walked behind it, and did not reappear. The base of this chorten was a cube built in stone less than 3 feet high, and formed its needle-shaped top to the ground. The small monument was no more than 7 feet high, and there was no cavity in it. Moreover, the chorten was completely isolated. There were neither houses, nor trees, nor undulations, nor anything that could provide a hiding in the vicinity. My servant and I believed that Wangdu was resting for a while under the shade of the chorten, but as time went by without his reappearing, I inspected the ground round the monument with my field glasses, but discovered nobody. Very much puzzled, I sent 2 of my servants to search for the boy. I followed their movements with the glasses, but no trace was to be found of Wangdu, nor of anybody else. That same day, a little before dusk, the young man appeared in the valley with his caravan. He wore the very same dress and the foreign sun hat which I had seen in my dream and in the morning vision. Without giving him or the load carriers time to speak with my servants and hear about the phenomenon, I immediately questioned them. From their answers, I learned that all of them had spent the previous night in a place too far distant from my dwelling for anyone to reach the latter in the morning. It was also clearly stated that Wangdu had continually walked with the party. During the following weeks, I was able to verify the accuracy of the men's declarations by inquiring about the time of the caravan's departure at the few last stages where the porters were changed. It was proved that they had all spoken the truth and had left the last stage together with Wangdu, as they said. And then in the second entry in Alexandra's diary, she wrote about a painter that she had a certain experience with, and here's how it went. A Tibetan painter, a fervent worshipper of wrathful deities who took a particular delight in drawing their terrible forms, came one afternoon to pay me a visit. I noticed behind him the somewhat nebulous shape of one of the fantastic beings which often appeared in his paintings. I made a startled gesture, and the astonished artist took a few steps towards me, asking what was the matter. I noticed that the phantom did not follow him, and quickly thrusting my visitor aside, I walked to the apparition with one arm stretched in front of me. My hand reached the foggy form. I felt as if touching a soft object whose substance gave way under the slight push, and the vision vanished. The painter confessed in answer to my questions that he had been performing I think it's pronounced duptab. Now, I've probably just murdered that word, but I believe it is a word for magic rite or invocation. So he'd been performing a duptab rite during the last few weeks, calling on the deity whose form I had dimly perceived. And that very day he had worked the whole morning on a painting of the same deity. In fact, the Tibetan's thoughts were entirely concentrated on the deity whose help he wished to secure for a rather mischievous undertaking. He himself had not seen the phantom. In these 2 cases, the phenomenon was produced without the conscious cooperation of its author. Or, as a mystic Lama remarked, Wangdu and the painter could hardly be termed the authors of the phenomena. They were but one cause, maybe the principal one, amongst the various causes which had brought them about. The next story Alexander Davy Neal tells is when she was out camping one day and she was with her cook in a hut which they used as a kitchen. And then she starts the story like this. The boy asked me for some provisions. I answered, "Come with me to my tent. You can take what you need out of the boxes." We walked out, and when nearing my tent, we both saw the hermit llama seated on a folding chair next to my camp table. This did not surprise us because the llama often came to talk with me. The cook only said, "Rinpoche is there. I must go and make tea for him at once. I will take the provisions later on." I replied, "All right, make tea and bring it to us." The man turned back, and I continued to walk straight towards the llama, looking at him all the time while he remained seated, motionless. When I was only a few steps from the tent, a flimsy veil of mist seemed to open before it, like a curtain that is pulled aside, and suddenly I did not see the llama anymore. He had vanished. A little later, the cook came bringing tea. He was surprised to see me alone. As I did not like to frighten him, I said Rinpoche only wanted to give me a message. He had no time to stay for tea. I related the vision to the llama, but he only laughed at me without answering my questions. Yet upon another occasion he repeated the phenomenon. He utterly disappeared as I was speaking with him in the middle of a wide bare tract of land, without tent or houses or any kind of shelter in the vicinity. Later on in the book, before she tells of her own encounter with her own tulpa that she created, she goes on to describe what she believes a tulpa is. She goes on to say that once a tulpa is endowed with enough vitality to be capable of playing the part of a real being, it tends to free itself from its maker's control. This, say Tibetan occultists, happens nearly mechanically, just as a child when its body is completed and able to live apart when it leaves a mother's womb. Sometimes a phantom becomes a rebellious son, and one hears of uncanny struggles that have taken place between magicians and their creatures, the former being severely hurt or even killed by the latter. Tibetan magicians also relate cases in which the tulpa is sent to fulfill a mission but does not come back and pursues its peregrination as a half-conscious, dangerously mischievous puppet. The same thing, it is said, may happen when the maker of the tulpa dies, before having dissolved it. Yet, as a rule, the phantom either disappears suddenly at the death of the magician or gradually vanishes like a body that perishes for want of food. She then goes on to describe how some people she had met believe that tulpas can survive after death and go on living, but she didn't put much faith into this. She believed it was just different people's opinions. She then goes on to say that the people who told her these theories have in the past been trustworthy, but in this case she believed they may have been delusional, and she is not claiming that it is one way or the other. She is just merely relating to the reader what she has heard herself. And then Alexander Devi Neal goes on to tell of her own experience with her own tulpa that she had created. Alexander Devi Neal decided that she wanted to see if she could create her own tulpa, and she chose the form of a monk, short and fat, an innocent and jolly type character. Alexander Devi Neal says she went into a period of seclusion and processed to perform the prescribed concentration of thought and other rites. She then goes on to say that after a few months the phantom monk was formed. His form grew gradually, fixed and lifelike looking. He became a kind of guest living in my apartment. I then broke my seclusion and started for a tour with my servants and tents. The monk included himself in the party. Though I lived in the open, riding on horseback for miles each day, the illusion persisted. I saw the fat trapper now and then. It was not necessary for me to think of him to make him appear. The phantom performed various actions of the kind that are natural to travellers and that I had not commanded. For instance, he walked, stopped, and looked around. The illusion was mostly visual, but sometimes I felt as if a robe was lightly rubbing against me, and once a hand seemed to touch my shoulder. The features which I imagined when building my phantom gradually underwent a change. The fat, chubby-cheeked fellow grew leaner, his face assumed a vaguely mocking, sly, malignant look. He became more troublesome and bold. In brief, he escaped my control. Once a herdsman who brought me a present of butter saw the tulpa in my tent and took it for a live llama. I ought to have let the phenomenon follow its course, but the presence of that unwanted companion began to prove trying to my nerves. It turned into a day nightmare. Moreover, I was beginning to plan my journey to Lhasa and needed a quiet brain devoid of other preoccupations. So I decided to dissolve the phantom. I succeeded, but only after 6 months of hard struggle. My mind creature was tenacious of life. There is nothing strange in the fact that I may have created my own hallucination. The interesting point is that in these cases of materialization, others see the thought forms that have been created. Tibetans disagree in their explanations of such phenomenon. Some think a material form is really brought into being, others consider the apparition as mere case of suggestion, the creator's thought impressing others and causing them to see what he himself sees. In spite of clever efforts made by the Tibetans to find rational explanations for all prodigies, a number remain unexplained, perhaps because they are pure inventions or perhaps for other reasons. Now, what I found interesting about Alexander David Neal's experience with tulpas is that in 2 of those accounts, the tulpas resembled their hosts in every single way, and this automatically made me think of doppelgangers. Now, is it possible that a doppelganger is a form of a tulpa? I don't know if you remember, but I did cover a story on doppelgangers about a French lady who lived way back in 1845, I think it was, and she was a teacher at the school, and the students had often seen her sat at a desk in a trance-like state, and Emily, the teacher, would just sit there silently, not teaching the class, just sat staring straight ahead in a trance-like state, like I said. So the students would eventually get up from the desk and go and see if she was okay, and when they would reach out to touch her, it was like their hands were going through a veil of cobwebs, and then the apparition disappeared. It turned out that Emily was actually reading a book under a tree in the garden, and she wasn't actually in the classroom, and this happened on multiple occasions in different parts of the school, and it was said that she couldn't hold down a job and she was constantly moving from school to school because of this strange occurrence that was happening. And so hearing Alexander David Neal's experience with tulpas and how they seem to be doppelgangers, it does make me wonder whether there is a connection there. So it would seem that tulpas stem from Tibetan Buddhism. It is said that monks used the practice to help them overcome fears, and then their tulpa would simply disappear afterwards. Over the years, this has seemed to have changed a little bit, and now tulpas seem to stay with the host as long life companions if the host wishes. But the Tibetan way of creating the tulpa is not used as much anymore. The subject of tulpa was more or less ignored in the modern world until the 1960s, when it very briefly reappeared as an aid for self-help. But in 2003, a website was launched named 4chan. It was on this site that people could go for a wide selection of topics, including anime, manga, video games, cooking, weapons, television, music, literature, history, fitness, politics, and sports, as well as many other things. It was on this site in 2011 that the subject of tulpas was once again brought forward, but in the form of creepypastas, like I said at the beginning of the episode, short-form horror stories created by users of the site. And it wasn't long before some users started to share their beliefs that tulpas were in fact real, and the creation of a tulpa was in fact very possible. And then a few creation guys followed, but it wasn't long before a little bit of controversy was starting to build up around the message boards, and the topic of tulpa was deleted. But for some strange reason, the subject of tulpas kind of got mixed up in a different topic on the 4chan website, and it may surprise you to find out that that topic was My Little Pony. Now, the My Little Pony board was created to be a place to go and post and talk about My Little Ponies without ridicule, and for the fans of My Little Ponies who call themselves bronies, this was actually a very safe place to come and chat about My Little Pony. And eventually, like I said before, the subject of tulpas started popping up on the My Little Pony boards, and the My Little Pony fans became fascinated in the possibility of creating their very own thought form, their own tulpa that would take on the form of their favourite pony. Back then, it was accepted to create a tulpa based off an established character. Nowadays, it's not really accepted. Many believe by doing this, you're forcing a personality onto your tulpa instead of allowing it to create a personality of its own. Eventually, the community would move over to Discord, where the subject was hugely expanded upon, which I have actually been told by many users on the Reddit page is the place to go. And this kind of brings us up to date, although the rabbit hole on this subject goes so much deeper, and a lot of things have changed since the 4chan days. I would say that much of the information out there can actually contradict itself at times, but I'd also say that many tulpamancers have their own process and beliefs when creating a tulpa. And it's also believed now that tulpas should even have their own rights and treated as a person, just like their host. If this does sound like something you would like to research more, and believe me, there is plenty more information to learn, I will leave a few links in the podcast description that really helped me on this episode. Also, the Reddit page and the Discord is full of friendly, helpful people who are more than willing to give advice and opinions, and I know that firsthand. So what do you think? Are tulpas real? Are they paranormal? Or are they merely concentrated thought forms that seem real to the person imagining them? As always, I'll let you decide. Until next time, take care of yourselves and all your tulpas, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye.